Let's move on to Module 2. We'll look at some configuration use cases. In our first example, a new person has joined your organization. That person is the HR team manager. He or she needs to access, create, and manage all of the HR-related spaces, users, and groups. Let's try to fully understand the requirements. In order to do this, we need to ask several questions. Who is the team leader? What exactly does she or he need to do? Which spaces does he or she need to access? There are three statements that must be analyzed when dealing with permissions: who, what, and where. Who addresses user-related questions. We need to know the user's username and their group membership. What defines the scope of the required configuration changes. What is the user able to do in terms of permissions right now? And finally, we deal with where. The where provides the context of a requirement or problem. What content can she access right now? Once we have collected all information for these three areas, we have established the current setup and can start analyzing the gap to the target setup. To get started, let's look at some common questions that we should ask to establish the who, what, and where. Let's start by looking at the user who is involved in our scenario. Her name is Claudia. Has Claudia been added to a user in Confluence? What is her username? Is Claudia a member of any groups? Has she been granted any permissions already? You access Confluence administration and search for Claudia. You can confirm Claudia has one account and a username, CG, and she's a member of the default Confluence users group. As a member of that group, she has the can use global permission. Any permission-related configuration or troubleshooting use case needs to be analyzed to understand its full scope. We are managing permissions, so we need to establish which permissions we need to manage. In this case, it is likely to be all three levels: global and space level permissions, and then possibly page level access. Then we need to understand where, in which space, Claudia needs to access content. During this phase of the analysis, we will gather the bulk of the information that we need to find a solution. The amount of information you need depends on the complexity of the requirement and any existing permissions and access that Claudia already has. When we find an answer to each question, it marks a decision point that needs to be considered in the gap analysis and then in the implementation of a solution. Let's look at those questions. We need to ask, can Claudia access any HR-related spaces? How does the HR team access spaces now? Which groups does her team have membership in? Does Claudia need additional global permissions? Which spaces does Claudia need to access? Who can implement the change? We refer to the existing Confluence configurations and consult Claudia. We have established that there are three HR-related spaces. Claudia cannot access them. The HR team accesses their spaces via membership in the HR team group. Claudia has Confluence access to some spaces through her membership in the Confluence users group. Claudia needs to be able to create spaces, so she needs an additional global permission. Claudia has requested the ability to manage users and groups. In order to do that, we would need to give her administrative global permissions. A user with global level administration permissions can implement the changes. Next, we need to understand what Claudia needs to access and what she needs to be able to do with that content. Does she just need to view it, or does she need all of the space permissions? Does she need to be able to access all content in the space? Finally, since Claudia is a manager, she has requested the ability to do so. Does she need to be able to manage users as an administrator, or does she just need to be able to manage access to her team's spaces? Here, we have established that Claudia not only requires access to a number of spaces, but that she will be managing those spaces too. Claudia is currently a member of the Confluence users group, and she is not a member of any other Confluence group. We've established that there's an HR-related group already, and Claudia doesn't have membership in that group. Claudia will be managing the HR-related spaces. She'll be managing the content in those spaces, and she'll be managing access to those spaces. She has also requested global level administration permissions. We have to decide if that's something we will allow. We have also established that there is one existing Confluence group of interest, the HR team group. Currently, Claudia is not a member of this group. Now that we have some answers, let's bridge the gap between the current setup and user needs. Analyzing the gap is a part of the process where we identify the configuration elements that are needed in order to meet the requirements. In our current use case, the gap is quite clear. Claudia already has access to Confluence as a licensed user with the Can Use global permission. She has been granted this permission through her membership in the Confluence users group. She can already access some content in spaces where members of the Confluence users group have been granted the space permissions to do so. This is our baseline. Now the gap. As a manager of the HR team, Claudia wants to be able to manage all of the HR-related spaces and also create HR-related spaces. She'll need an additional global permission. She needs the Create Spaces global permission. The next decision is whether to grant Claudia a Confluence Administrator level global permission. With this permission, she can grant herself space admin permissions for each of the existing HR spaces. She would also be able to manage her team members' access to Confluence and the groups that her team belongs to. Do we give her administration access? And if so, which level of administration does she need? Next, Claudia needs permissions to administer the existing HR-related spaces. We need to decide if these permissions will be granted to Claudia personally or if we add her to a group with these permissions. We need to understand if all members of the HR team group will be able to administer their spaces or if a smaller group of users should do so. And then, do we manage these users in groups or as individuals? And then we need to decide how we can give her access to all of the pages, including those which have restrictions applied to them. So it's time to identify the best implementation. The best implementation is a very subjective concept. It's a balance of the needs of the end user and the needs of the application administration team, aligned with organizational policies and practices. Since these needs and policies differ on an organizational basis, we can't insist that there is a non-negotiable best implementation of any configuration. When you are considering an implementation for a new configuration, there are always different approaches. With permissions, when we are managing a Confluence instance for a company, it is often the case that we need to provide as much access as is necessary without compromising security. Throughout, it is always important to consider the needs and experiences of users along with the need for an effective and efficient instance. Your implementation should be robust. Users come and go, change job roles, leave or go on vacation. Don't let any configuration depend on single users. Permissions should be based on group membership. It should be future-proof. You don't want to have to update your implementation every time someone leaves. It should be scalable. Using individuals and permissions will mean your instance will struggle to scale. It should be transparent. Use configurations for groups, spaces, and permissions that are standardized, documented, and shared with your teams. Finally, it should be manageable. Again, go for generic, standardized solutions. Where possible, delegate minor administration tasks to other users. Do you, for example, want to be responsible for creating every space and then managing the permissions for each space? Let's revisit our use case. Let's review the requirements and current state. Claudia needs to access all content in the HR spaces. She also needs to be able to create and manage HR spaces for the HR team. She has asked to manage users and groups. Claudia belongs to the Confluence users group and she has Can Use global permission. There is one HR group, the HR team. This group has Can Use global permission. There are 3 existing HR spaces. We could grant Claudia, as an individual user, all of the permissions that she needs to access and administer the spaces. On reviewing the spaces, we see that the HR team group is granted a minimum set of permissions in each HR-related space. They have view and delete permissions for content, comments, and attachments. This is definitely a non-negotiable part of our implementation. Let's add Claudia to the HR team group, and she will have the same set of access and permissions as all other team members. We've met part of requirement number 1. Claudia now has access to all of the HR-related spaces. Great. She doesn't have access to every single page in the spaces because she can't manage restrictions, but we're part of the way there. So Claudia can access content in the HR-related spaces, but there's more. What about the other components of the requirement? Let's look at another part of the requirement. Claudia needs to be able to create spaces for the HR team. This is a global permission. Let's consider how we would grant Claudia the Create Spaces global permission. We could grant the permission to Claudia as an individual user, or we could grant her membership in the Confluence Administrators Group, which is granted that permission by default. We could also grant the global permission to a group that Claudia has membership in. Let's consider each option, starting with granting the permission to Claudia as an individual user. Now bear in mind that we need to apply a scalable, future-proof, and robust implementation. We already said that granting permissions to individuals isn't scalable, so let's rule that out immediately for any part of our solution. Okay, so no individual permissions. We'll manage permissions by granting them to groups. But which groups? We could just grant Claudia membership in a group that already has the Create Spaces global permission. The powerful Confluence Administrators Group has Create Spaces global permission. But wait, let's think back to our best practices. We have said that we should grant the minimum permissions necessary. Membership in this group would allow Claudia to fully manage the whole Confluence instance. So let's rule that option out for now. What are the other options? We could grant the Create Spaces global permission to groups that Claudia already belongs to. She belongs to the HR team and Confluence users groups. If we grant the Create Spaces global permission to either of these groups, is there a problem here? This would give many users the ability to create spaces. Think about best practices and giving out the minimum permissions necessary. Giving large numbers of users the ability to create new spaces would likely result in the creation of hundreds of spaces that you'll need to manage. So, what's the next option? We're not going to grant the Create Spaces permission to existing groups. What about creating a new group and granting that group the necessary permissions? Claudia is one of 3 HR managers. We could create a new group for HR managers. We can use this group for managing permissions needed for management-related tasks. Perfect. We'll create a new group named HR Managers and add all HR managers to that group. This leads us to the next part of the requirement. Claudia has asked to manage HR, users, and groups. This would require membership in the Confluence Administrators Group or membership in a group granted the Confluence Administrator Global Permission. We spoke about best practices and giving out the minimum permissions needed. You'll find that as an administrator, you often get requests like this. The request needs to be dealt with diplomatically, but as an administrator, you need to balance the management of your instance with supporting the needs of your users. Sometimes you have to diplomatically say no. From the Confluence administration team's perspective, Claudia will only manage her team, and her team has less than 20 members. We don't expect it to grow too much, so we can predict that there isn't going to be too much to manage. Claudia is also not expected nor required to manage any other aspect of the Confluence app. In the interest of smooth application management, we do not want to give her access to any of the application configuration settings. Also, from an organizational perspective, we want to minimize any possibility of breaching data security. Having the Confluence Administrator Global Permission will grant her the possibility of accessing all content in Confluence, if she knows how to do so. This means that we should not give Claudia any global-level administration permissions. Sorry, Claudia, you will have to send requests for new users and group management to the Confluence Application Management Team instead. So, we are going to create a group named HR Managers and grant that group the Create Spaces global permission. Let's use the group we've just created and grant the HR Managers all of the permissions for those spaces. That way, members of that group can manage access to the space and perform all space-level administration tasks. We've already added Claudia to the HR team group. To complete the implementation, a member of the Confluence Application Administration team with global level administration permissions must create a new group named HR Managers, add all users who are HR managers, including Claudia, to the new group, grant the group the Create Spaces global permission, grant the group all space permissions for existing spaces, instruct HR managers to grant the HR managers group all space permissions in any space they might create. Now that we have implemented the best possible solution for our Confluence instance, we have one group for HR users and one group for HR managers. Each group has been granted the correct permissions for both Claudia and her team. We weren't able to grant Claudia an administrative global permission, but she does have the ability to manage and administer spaces. In our next use case, we are asked to give clients access to only their own content in Confluence. Before finding a solution, you need to gather the requirements details. Again, we need to ask a lot of questions as initial requirement was quite vague. Let's try to understand what the needs really are. How many customer companies need access to Confluence? 3 companies will be given access, with at least 1 user per company. Is the number of companies and related users expected to grow? Yes. Since we expect this type of user to grow, we must plan to make a robust and scalable solution. Next question to ask: will we give each customer a license, or are we going to allow anonymous access? Well, security and preventing any data breaches is a big concern, so we will not allow anonymous access. We have to give each user a license so they can log into Confluence. And what about spaces? How will we manage them? Will each customer need their own space, or will all customers share one space? Due to security concerns, each customer needs their own space. And then, what will customers be able to do in their spaces? Which space permissions will we grant the customer? Customers will have a reduced set of permissions. They will not be able to export or administer the space. They can delete their own content, but otherwise they will not be given content delete permissions. They will not be able to delete or add page restrictions. Okay, so now that we know more detail, let's understand our setup right now and figure out how we can configure a robust solution for our customers. First, let's understand how all users are brought in and managed right now. As per Confluence default settings, all users are added to the Confluence users group. That group is granted the can use permission. Then, groups are created on departmental and project lines. Users are added to those groups. Now, let's understand how space permissions work right now. Default space permissions grant Confluence users restricted permissions to view content only. The group space admin is granted all space permissions by default so that members of that group can administer spaces. Then, as spaces are created, we have an example of how permissions are granted to groups. The finance team group are granted most non-administrative permissions, and the finance managers are granted all space permissions. The space admin group remains with all space permissions, although, of course, members of the finance managers group can remove the space admin group and manage the space as they wish. We need to plan for how our customer users will be brought in, how will they be managed in groups, and how the new spaces will be managed. Since we already have a way of setting up users in groups, we can replicate that model to an extent, but we need to update the default space settings and all existing spaces. All new users are added to the Confluence users group as per the default, uneditable settings in Confluence. We can continue to grant that catch-all group the can-use permission. We'll create a new group per customer and add relevant customers to each group. Going forward, we'll have to update the default space permissions to remove the default setting that grants space permissions to members of the Confluence users group. All new users, including customers, are added to this default group, and we don't want customer users to have any access to any other spaces. Then, we go into the newly created customer space, add the customer group, and grant them a limited set of space permissions. Customer users will not be able to delete content, export the space, administer the space, or add and delete restrictions. There is one final step. We need to perform an audit of all spaces and remove any of the Confluence users in any space. We don't want customers to be able to access any other content in Confluence, so we must remove the Confluence users group where it is used in space permissions. If we remove the Confluence users group from any space permissions, your organizational users will most likely not be able to access the spaces that they used to access. You'll have to deal with a lot of complaints. To resolve this problem, you should create a new group named, for example, Your Organization Users. Add all the users in your organization to that group. In existing spaces, replace the Confluence users group with the Your Organization Users group. Make sure the permissions granted to Your Organization Users group are the same as those granted to the Confluence users group. All of this can involve user error, and the worst case scenario would be a data breach. Space administrators could accidentally give access to customer groups or customers. It is for this reason the administration permissions should be given out to as few users as possible. It is also important to double and triple check changes applied to Confluence when they relate to permissions and external users. So, document carefully, log in with test user accounts, and double check configuration changes. All of this activity will take time, and so should be completed during a period where downtime will not impact users, perhaps later in the evening or over a weekend. Ideally, you'll have already planned for external use, and you would have set up external use when you were setting up Confluence. And if you're in the position of being in the early stages of setting up Confluence, think carefully about expansion and the possibility of external user access. And that completes the use case.